Okay, the next one I want to talk about is powdery scab, and I did give a presentation on this at the potato conference, but this, I have added a little more information since then from some work that we have done, and I do want to recognize my cooperators here, both Nora Olson and James Woodall, who would help with this project. Before I do, I hope this works. I have a video. Have you seen these little dolls that fly? Everything started off good. And I can just, as a parent, I can just see the pain of what's happening here. You think of a worse way to ruin Christmas? Now, I don't have any daughters. I have 4 boys. And those creeps, one of my sons says, every time I feel sad, I watch this movie, it makes me happy. You jerk. You need this poor little girl. And I think we can relate this to powdery scab, maybe more so Mop Top Virus, is that these diseases are very, very difficult to control. And it may be you think the crop is going great and everything's working fine, and then all of a sudden at the end, all of a sudden these symptoms show up that cause a lot of problems. And so what can we do about it? And I'll just tell you right now, there's not a lot of good news when it comes to managing this disease. In fact, I would say that of all the diseases that we deal with, this is probably the most problematic, the hardest to take care of. So these pictures here, this shows a potato with a powdery scab. It looks like you have these little lesions. They almost look like little volcanoes where something's exploded out through the skin. And if you could look and zoom in and look really close, you'd see these little spore balls. And all of those together, they look a little bit powdery, and that's the name powdery scab. And if you could even zoom in closer, you'd see these little openings and these spores that come out. This spore actually looks somewhat like what you'd see with pink rot or with late blight. So they have the swimming spore stage. So you can guess, moist soils favor the spread of this disease, all right? And it will infect the roots and cause these galls. These are not nitrogen-fixing nodules like we see in other crops. This is actually the powdery scab fungus, and they'll also infect the tuber. So you can have multiple cycles of this in a year. Very, very problematic. Here I've got a little gall on one of my roots, but along the stem you'll notice these small brown lesions here. And some of these, well, it may look like rhizome, some of these are actual powdery scab infections. And so a gall may develop there or it may not. If we go on, this is a nightshade plant. A friend of mine, Gary Taylor, once was up in the St. Anthony area, actually Egan Bench, and we were walking around a field where the potatoes were dead. And actually, once the potato plant dies, most of the galls on the roots will fall off. So if you go late in the season, you're pulling up potato plants, you may not see any galls that could have been there earlier. But there was some nightshade on the very, very edge of the field. And so we went and pulled those up, and sure enough, there were galls on the root of the nightshade plants. This is a Shepady tuber. Shepady is highly susceptible to infection. And of course, that doesn't look very good. It can be peeled off. The lesions don't go very deep, but they can cause problems when we think about the fact that this organism, it's actually really like a slime mold, like a protist. It's not really a true fungus. That's one reason that many of the fungicides that we have don't work on it, but because it carries a virus. And so that's going to be more problematic for us than maybe the damage that's done by the powdery scab organism. This is a russet variety. I believe this was a russet Burbank. And we have these small black lesions here. And we had these tested, and it turned out that these were all powdery scab lesions. So you may dig up your tubers and look at them and say, hey, they look pretty clean. It doesn't look like I have anything on them. But you could have some very minute infection with powdery scab. So the symptoms, typically, there can be foliar symptoms above grams, pretty rare. We don't see that very often. They are similar to what we would see with calico. This is Mop Top Virus. It's favored by cool weather And so when it's really, really hot, oftentimes, even though the plant is infected, it may not show symptoms. Okay, we get necrotic arcs. There is some research that says it may have to deal with alternating storage temperatures for those to show up better. But it can be very difficult to differentiate these from, say, tobacco rattle virus, which is corky ring spot, and then PBY-NTN, and even internal brown spot. I think all of these can look very similar. So I myself, I do not feel very comfortable if someone brings a potato that they think has Mop Top virus, just based on a visual assessment. I often don't feel good enough saying for sure that's what it is. In fact, I would recommend if you're worried about it, you need to get it tested at a diagnostic lab. It's just too easy to confuse these. So just remember, if you've ever had a visual symptom, it's got to be confirmed. They do tend to increase with time of storage. So the degree that you might see a Mop Top, say a harvest, I mean, they're not going to get any better in storage, but it may get worse. And you may see some external symptoms. So this is from Jonathan Whitworth. And actually, one of these pictures shows Mop Top virus and one shows tobacco rattle virus. Do you feel confident you can distinguish which is which from these? As it turns out, this is the potato Mop Top virus, and this is tobacco rattle virus. So these concentric arcs, or you can see they're part of a concentric ring here. This is what we typically tend to think of Mop Top is causing, but you also have other symptoms that aren't as diagnostic. Over here with my tobacco rattle virus, I have this slice that I see, I have two concentric arcs there, very similar to each other. And so this is why you really have to get this tested to know which is which. Here's another symptom, and this is pretty characteristic of what we might expect with Mop Top, that this could very well be tobacco rattle virus. But in this case, these are both Mop Top. You can get external symptoms where the tuber skin will appear to flake off, and you cut below and you might see just very mild spots. So it's not severe like some of the previous pictures I showed you. So there's a wide range of symptoms associated with this. Now, powdery scab is favored by cool, wet soils. This is the temperature that it likes, alternating wet-dry conditions. Everything that we do, right? You think about the way we raise potatoes here and what the soil temperatures are, and with our irrigated conditions in the soil, we do this all year long. Some research said that this 3 to 4 weeks after tuber initiation was maybe more of a critical period for infection. And so perhaps there's some things that we could do to change that would make it better or reduce the disease. This seems a little bit contradictory, but sandy soils, and then again, those with poor drainage should be more conducive. And I think the sandy soils, you get more of these alternating wet-dry, and poor drainage, you just have saturated conditions, those spores last longer as they swim in the soil. Tuber infection is considered to occur typically around tuber initiation, and you don't have to have much inoculum to cause disease. So one thing that James Woodall has done is he's come out into our fields and he's actually pulled soil samples and tell you, do you have the powdery scab organism out in your soil? He's also able to tell you, do you have the Mop Top virus? Do we have DNA from both of these organisms present? And he'll report back that you think we're very small amounts, but it's still enough to cause disease. So what do we recommend you do to deal with powdery scab? Now, we hope that by managing powdery scab, we'll also be managing Mop Top at the same time. And I'm not sure how good of an assumption that is, but that's the best that we have to go on. So these recommendations, you see them in a lot of different places, kind of a laundry list of things that are supposed to help you. But I would contend that most of these are of no use to you whatsoever. Okay, they don't help. Planting disease-free seed, that is one that's probably useful. So if you're able to look at your seed and you see, do I have you don't want to be bringing Mop Top in with you into the field. Having said that, there's a pretty good chance that, or I would be surprised if we have a field in southern Idaho that doesn't have some exposure to powdery scab. In Israel, they did some studies and they would collect sand blowing in the wind, and they were able to pick up powdery scab, the powdery scab organism, and the wind-blown sand. So you can imagine, you probably have it here in just about every field here in the state. They say avoid planting in contaminated, poorly drained soils. Well, wouldn't that be nice if you had enough ground that you could just go out and decide and choose to pick each year where you're going to plant potatoes and where you're not going to plant potatoes. I mean, often that's dictated, your rotation is pretty much dictated to you with the available land that you have. So this doesn't really help us too much. Talk about using manure. If animals have been fed infected tubers, those spore balls can actually pass through the gut of the animal into the manure and they'll be viable. And that is true even if the manure has been composted. And so that's another avenue of bringing spores into the field. They recommend rotating out infested fields for 5 years, but then another report says it can survive for 12 years. I read somewhere where it said it can survive in the soil for 30 years. And I don't know if that's true. I'm not even sure how they figured that one out. But the point is, it's long enough, it'll live there long enough. The crop rotation really doesn't help us. It's not a practical solution. Resistant cultivars. You know, we do have some that don't show the symptoms very well, and I would actually say this is probably the most useful recommendation on the list. Avoid tomato. I know that could be a problem for some of you guys, right? Tomato in your rotation. Controlling nightshade, we're trying to do that anyway. And then number 7, this is one that we see a lot. This is based on the idea that those waterlogged conditions, especially early in the season, will favor infection. So what if we could cut back the water? We manage our irrigation water. And you guys have all heard me talk about this. I know that all of you manage your irrigation water perfectly and your neighbor screws it up, right? And if anyone wants to challenge you about your irrigation management, they might as well be challenging you to a duel or insulting your mother or something like that. But we've got to try to see if is that a useful recommendation. So what we did is we set up these plots where we have basically we have an above ground sprinkler system in the field where I can differentially apply water. And some of you have come out to the field and you've seen these. We have these poles that we put these mini wobblers on top. These are often used in a greenhouse. And the nice thing about those is the way we have them set up is they produce a pretty uniform water pattern without having the nozzles have to move like we have on a pivot. So the field was set up where we'd have 4 different replications, and the water system will cover 8 rows. So each one of these blocks is 8 rows wide. The dark blue, we were at 100% ET. So we're just trying to irrigate about 3 times a week, Trent, 3 or 4 times a week. We would try to just keep the water right at ET, and then we had a reduced irrigation, and that was only during tuber initiation. So there's about a month, about 3-week period where we cut back on the water, and then kind of as a check, we had one where we reduced the irrigation all year long. And because I had 8 rows to work with, on one side, I would do a treatment of some kind, on the other side, I would not. And that treatment changed from the 2 years that we did the study. And so we also used the monitoring system that Simplot has and help see how is our soil moisture doing through all of this. And to our knowledge, this is the very first time someone's done a research trial where they tried to vary field moisture to manage Mop Top or Powdery Scab. So this is another shot of the system in action. So we can just turn each one on at varying times to make sure that we got the different levels of water out in the field. So the irrigation treatment, there's not a lot you have to worry about from this slide. This just shows the amount of water that was put on each plot. So in May we put on 6300s, and this was just to set the herbicide. And so all the treatments got that the same. We did get a lot of rain that year. We had 1 inch in May, but then we had very little rain after that. None in June, and just barely detectable in July and August. So at 100%, we put on 8 inches here, 10, about 6.5, so we end up with 25.5 inches total this year. The 80% early, you can see we reduced it in June, but then once we got into July and August, it was the same. So we ended up with 24 inches. So just going at 80% that early part, we ended up putting on 95% of the total water compared to the check. So 5% reduction. We thought maybe that's, could we live with that? The one that was 80% year long, again, as you might suspect, we put on 80% of the total irrigation. And what did we see? Well, we used Alturas, and we didn't see any powdery scab symptoms on the roots. Okay, and we didn't see really any on the tubers, but we did see some mop top. So we know we had infection, and we looked at the visual mop top symptoms at harvest. It was about the same. So varying the irrigation did not help us when it came to the mop top symptom. In this year, 4 of the rows were untreated. The other 4 had omega at 3 pints per acre. That also did not seem to help us at all. We didn't get any benefit from that. So the only thing that reducing irrigation did for me, the only benefit I had was that I didn't have to harvest as many potatoes. So, and this, it should surprise us, right? There's a reason we try to irrigate to ET, because that's going to give us the best yield result. But remember, we were only 5% lower with this 80% ET, and yet I had over 70 sack reduction. So this was 2021. What do you remember about 2021? It was one of the hottest years we've ever had. And so it probably wasn't the best year to do an irrigation reduction trial. But you see, it hammered the US ones pretty bad. We had more colds, especially where we were lower water all year long. And again, we didn't see any benefit from using the omega during this time. So, yeah, nothing good came out of this trial. Of course, we want to try it again. This was after storage. And again, this year we didn't have much of a change in the mop top symptoms. And we had these tubers tested to make sure they were mop top and they weren't, say, tobacco rattle virus. And all the ones that we sent in came back positive for potato mop top virus. So the take home from year 1, reducing irrigation, it didn't help with PMTV symptoms. And the use of fluazin or omega, it didn't help us that year. Some work had come out recently looking at 2,4-D and some other plant growth regulators saying that they might be able to reduce powdery scab. So this is the incidence of powdery scab lesions, looking at 2,4-D, and these are very, very low rates. But you see there is this reduction. And so we thought, well, maybe we could do that instead of using omega, and we use that a lot. And honestly for us, we rarely show a significant reduction in powdery scab when we used omega. It has suppression on the label, and there's some work out of Colorado State that shows that it can reduce it, but I don't know that it reduces it enough to be cost effective. So fast forward, we thought we're going to swap out the omega and we're going to use 2,4-D instead, based on this research. And so we thought 80%, that was too much. What if we go to 90% reduction instead? So here we have the 100% ET. Again, we're setting the chemical, we're setting our herbicide in May, and then you can see how much water we put on June, July, August, September. We did 90% ET early, from tuber initiation to about row close. And so you can see we had a cutback here in June into July. If you remember, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, in 2022, our season was delayed. Everything was pushed back. And so we were extending that treatment a little bit longer, but then after that, we finished out the season. And at the end, we had almost 98% of the total water that the 100% ET did. The 90% season long, you can see that's what it came out to. And because of what we did in May, it turns out it was actually 91%. And then ET late, we thought, what if we cut off the water towards the end? And so there is a reduction here in August and September, and we ended up with 98%, very similar to what we did before. So the question is, did this help us? What did we get from here? And using the 2,4-D, we were using 0.75 fluid ounces per acre of the product. We ended up with a significant reduction in the incidence of powdery scab galls. So this would support what the other research had found, that using this, for whatever reason, the way that this chemical interacts with the plant, it's causing a reduction in the incidence of root galls. Now the severity, so this is the number of plants that we saw that had root galls, so quite a significant reduction. There weren't a lot of galls in the roots. This is actually Shepity that we were working with, so very, very few, and we don't see a difference here. But when it came to the tuber scab, we didn't really see a difference with that. So even though it helped us on the stems, it didn't help us on the tubers. And the severity of the tubers was very low. Now let's look at the yield. We did have an reduction in the visual mop top symptoms. It was still there, it was slightly lower, but the problem with this was we also had a reduction in yield again. So coming from 100 down to 90, remember I was about 98% of where I thought I needed to be. They both have the letter A, so we see they're not statistically different, but you do see that it is lower, numerically lower for both total and marketable yield. Where I was 90% all year long, that was significantly lower. And reducing this 90% late was significantly lower than this. I think one reason for this is we were cool early on in the year. If you all know that, the temperatures were lower, so the plants weren't stressed as much. But what happened towards the end of the season last year? It was almost like a repeat of 2021. We had all this heat come on, so even though I was reducing it, or because I was reducing it, we believe it was exposed to more stress. So the reduction we get with 2,4-D is, how good is that? Is that something we should use? Well, it caused a significant yield reduction, both total and marketable yield. When we did apply it, we did see a symptom on the plant. I forgot to put that picture in here. So it did cause, it looked like herbicide drift. It was fairly temporary. The plant seemed to grow out of it, and we thought maybe things would be okay. But at the end of the day, we still had almost a 30 sack reduction on our total yield, and we were close to 60 on our marketable yield. And the tuber size was just lower. The average tuber weight was lower for this. So is this going to be an effective tool? I think it's pretty safe to say that irrigation management, when it comes to this, is a waste of time, and that we should be recommending that. At least the ways that we can think of to try it. We try to replicate things that have been done in the greenhouse, and it just doesn't seem to work. You need to irrigate to keep up with the ET. And the 2,4-D, we were using 10 grams of active ingredient per acre. That's a pretty low rate. I mean, it was a very dilute spray solution. It did reduce root galling, and it did reduce mop top symptoms, but it also reduced yield and quality. So I guess we asked the question, can we go at a lower rate? Maybe can we do that and still have these benefits without this? These are all questions that we need to try and that we'll be working on in the future. So to summarize this, irrigation management not effective. Omega, we don't believe it's cost effective. The 2,4-D may work, but there are some negative things that we're going to have to deal with if we try to use that. So with that, you kind of end the talk. I kind of feel like I'm this headline here, right? Utah Poison Control Center reminds everyone not to take poison. It's pretty obvious, but when it comes to managing powdery scab and mop top, I guess I would add this. The work that Dennis Johnson did on powdery scab showed that it was very difficult for him. In fact, most of the time, he could not show a yield loss from powdery scab on the roots. So what effect does it have? If it's a tuber that's not going to show symptoms, the powdery scab itself, there's probably nothing you can do about it. I guess honestly, I wouldn't worry too much about it. The Mop Top virus is a whole other issue though. And especially if we start to see more and more incidents of that, symptoms, then I'm not sure what we're going to do. But the tools that we have, the recommendations that are given to us right now, they don't work that good. And so we've got to find more answers. But I do think it goes back to, if we can plant varieties that either don't get infected or don't show the symptoms very well, then that's probably our best way forward. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
What varieties don't show the symptoms as well? So Norcois?
Yeah, actually, so the question is what varieties don't show symptoms very well. And I don't, off Mop Top, I can't remember. I probably need to add, so we're going to put these presentations up on our website, and I will add that. We have a graph that's put up by North Dakota State University, and they kind of show resistant, sensitive varieties. Now, a lot of them aren't ones that we grow, but we do have some information. That North Dakota is on the more resistant side. It's one of the few diseases North Dakota that's really good with. And everything else, it's horrible. But with with powdery scab and mop top, it's on the resistant side. In fact, most of the russet varieties won't show tuber scab lesions. Shepherdie does, of the ones that we grow in there, Shepherdie's probably the most susceptible. Reds are very susceptible. Yukon Gold, the yellows, they tend to be on the more susceptible side. Other questions? With the light, I can hardly see any of you, so, oh, Brad.
At the potato school, you alluded to the idea that you were using some other auxin products. Anything, any reason to be excited about anything else?
Not yet. So, sorry, the question was, what about other auxin-based products, like say Rejuvenate? We have done a little bit of work with Rejuvenate. I'm not ready to come out and say anything based on my first year with the data, but what I saw this year so far, it didn't work as well as the 2,4-D did. So we didn't see as big of a reduction with that on the plants. We haven't rated the tubers yet though. They'll be coming out of storage next month, and we'll grade to see how they did on Mop Top at that point in time. So we are doing more every year. We actually have some work that we've been doing with the USDA, where they have a large virus management grant, and part of that is testing different management strategies to manage Mop Top virus. So that's why this is ongoing research. We're going to continue to work with Rejuvenate to see how it's going to go. We'll do some more 2,4-D, but if you have other ideas or suggestions, let me know. Through the years, we've tried almost every fungicide that we can think of that works on the swimming zoospores, and honestly, none of them have shown good efficacy. Any efficacy.